In the late 1800s or the early 1900s, the pine planks were laid perpendicular to the floor joist. This was a standard back in those days. You'd find at that point, after floor failures, they ended up using plaster lathes as a kind of a slip sheet. And so they put the plaster lathes down and then they'd lay the hardwood on top of it. And that was one thing that was the biggest problem trying to do floor repair when you've got like plaster lathes as a slip sheet trying to do your cut joints because you didn't know where they were. They were never in a consistent pattern. They ended up changing it. Well, here's you can see this is one thing you look at. You can see on how the subfloor was laid perpendicular. As we go through, humidification changes, the pine plank will contract, and look what happened to the wood floor. It panelized right on top of every one of the joints of the pine. That was one of the reasons why that they went to a diagonal. Now, with that, there is no way to fill these joints because you're not in control of the subfloor underneath it. So that is where you'll get, the next thing that happens is when this contracts, now that joint becomes loose, and what happens to it? It's moving vertically and will get noise. Now the other system, they ended up in around the 20s, they moved it to a diagonal pine, turned it 45 degrees. It provided a weaker subfloor because it ran to about 20 inches on the length of the plank between joist to joist, but they got rid of the panelizing problem. But it's still rigid enough to get the support between the floor joists because that's about 20 inches there, but it was a better system for doing the installation. And therefore, that was the trend that lasted for another 50 years. They have their limitations though. If any of us worked in those houses, you'll find anytime mechanical, plumbing, anybody cuts through them, you're gonna see a weak spot. Next thing is, like here you can see where it's been cut through for the toilet. This section here, unless it's beefed up from underneath, that toilet is the one that's gonna start rocking and creating noise. So you're gonna get your floor noise. Simply because we've broken that connection between that pipe, that one right there, and on the back side. And this is the other thing that creating noise in the early, when we're dealing with the homes that had the diagonal pine in the early 20s. The other one is when we have a pine floor that's laid diagonally and then added a new residence. This is the one we see is, for example, how many have done where you've done a 3-season porch, 4-season porch, and you've blown off to add on that room and the contractor put in plywood, and instead of actually bringing that plywood in 18 inches into the old structure that should have been back in here, they just joined it like that. The next thing that'll happen is because it's a separate building, it goes through expansion and contraction of the building separately. Our floorboards are going to contract, and we're going to end up having an open joint right there. And with the open joint, it unlocks from the tongue and groove. Next thing is we have movement and we have noise. That would be a structural issue. These are things why we have to tear in to do destructive testing in order to determine what the actual cause of the problem is.